Hi, welcome to Talking Text. Our passage is 1 Peter chapter 4 from verse 1. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you, but they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, Jesus suffered and died, but rose again to resurrection life. And Peter says to the believers, I want you to arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. This way of thinking where putting to death the flesh leads to life. And Peter, earlier in the book, had asked the believers to gird up the loins of their minds, to think clearly about the gospel. And this is another instance where he's asking them to arm their minds, to think clearly and to know that it is putting to death the flesh that leads to the life of God. He says, actually, in the past you lived for your passions, but we no longer live for our passions, but rather we live for the will of God. I want to ask you, do you live for your passions or for the will of God? And that's the challenge that Peter puts to them here. He says, actually, in the past, we've had enough time to pursue all our own sensuality, our own passions. He says, our own lawless idolatry, he calls it. He says, we've had enough time to see and pursue all those things, and to be honest, to discover that they actually lead to death. He says, we've had enough time to do all that like the unbelievers do. And he says, the unbelievers are often surprised when you don't want to join in this pursuit. He says, and he calls it the same flood of debauchery. He had just given them the picture of Noah and the flood, where actually we find the pursuit of all these things, idolatry, like living for ourselves, all these things are actually a flood which eventually drown us. It's only living for the will of God and putting to death the flesh which leads to life. And so he's describing this to the believers, saying, we don't need to pursue all those things anymore because they actually lead to death. Rather pursue the will of God. And he says, with respect, they get surprised when you don't join them. But then he says, one day we'll all have to give an account, the living and the dead, to Jesus for what we did while in the flesh. Scary thoughts in some ways, but so grateful that we have Jesus, who is the resurrection and the life. So I want to encourage you to live for the will of God and live for him, and pursue not your own passion or your own desire, but rather pursue Jesus. Thanks for letting the text talk.